Hey, welcome back, YouTubers. Today we're going to read chapter 14 of this book, The Turner Diaries, and see what happens to Mr. Turner this time. March 24th, 1994. Today I was tried on the charge of oath breaking, the most serious offense with which a member of the order can be charged. It was a harrowing experience, but I knew it was coming, and I am enormously relieved to have it behind me, despite the outcome. All during the months in my prison cell, I agonized over the question, did I, by failing to kill myself before I was captured, break my oath to the order? I must have reviewed in my mind 100 times the circumstances of my capture and the subsequent events, trying to convince myself that my behavior had been blameless, that I had fallen alive into the hands of my captors through no fault of my own. Today, I related the whole sequence of events to a jury of my peers. The summons came this morning via radio, and I knew immediately what it was for, although I was surprised at the address to which I was ordered to report, one of the newest and largest office buildings in downtown Washington. As an attractive receptionist ushered me into a conference room in a large suite of law offices, my apprehension was mixed with gratitude for the 3-day period of recuperation I had been allowed since the breakout. I had just slipped into the robe which I found waiting for me on a coat rack, when another door opened, and 8 other robed and hooded figures walked into the room and silently took seats around a large table. The last of the 8 had his hood pushed back, and I recognized the familiar features of Major Williams. The proceedings were brisk and bathed in an air of formality. After a little more than an hour of questioning, I was told to wait in a smaller adjoining room. I waited there for nearly 3 hours. When the others had finally finished discussing my case and had reached a decision, I was summoned back into the conference room. While I stood at one end of the table, Major Williams, seated at the other end, announced the verdict. His words, to the extent I can remember them, were as follows. Earl Turner, we have weighed your performance as a member of this order on 2 grounds, and we have found you wanting on both. First, in your conduct immediately prior to the police raid in which you were seized and imprisoned, you gave evidence of a shocking lack of maturity and sound judgment. Your indiscretion in visiting the girl in Georgetown, an act which, although not specifically forbidden, was not within the realm of your assigned duties, led directly to a situation in which you and the members of your unit were placed in extreme jeopardy and a valuable facility was lost to the organization. Because of this failure of judgment on your part, your period as a probationary member of the order is being extended for 6 months. Furthermore, your time as a prisoner will not count as part of your probation. Therefore, you will not be permitted the right of union before March of next year at the earliest. We find, however, that your conduct prior to the police raid does not constitute a violation of your oath. I breathed an audible sigh of relief upon hearing this last statement, but then Williams continued with a grimmer note in his voice. The fact that you were taken alive by the political police and remained alive during nearly a month of interrogation is a far more serious matter. In swearing your oath, you consecrated your life to the service of the order. You undertook to place your duty to the order ahead of all other things, including the preservation of your life at all times. You accepted this obligation willingly and with the knowledge that for the duration of our struggle, it entails a very substantial possibility of your actually having to give up your life in order to avoid breaking your oath. And you were specifically warned against falling alive into the hands of the political police and were given the means to avoid this. Yet you did fall into their hands and remained alive. The information they extracted from you seriously hampered the work of the organization in this area and placed many of our comrades in very grave danger. We understand, of course, that you did not make a conscious decision to violate your oath. We have carefully looked into the circumstances of your capture, and we are aware of the interrogation techniques the political police now use against our people. If you were merely a soldier in any other army in the world, you would be held blameless. But the order is not like any other army. We have claimed for ourselves the right to decide the fate of all our people and eventually to rule the world in accord with our principles. If we are to be worthy of this right, then we must be willing to accept the responsibility which goes with it. Each day we make decisions and carry out actions which result in the deaths of white persons, many of them innocent of any offense which we consider punishable. We are willing to take the lives of these innocent persons because a much greater harm will ultimately befall our people if we fail to act now. Our criterion is the ultimate good of our race. Our criterion is the ultimate good of our race. We can apply no lesser criterion to ourselves. Indeed, we must be much sterner with ourselves than with others. We must maintain for ourselves a standard of conduct much higher than we demand of the general public, or even of ordinary members of the organization. In particular, we must never accept the idea, born of sickness of our era, that a good excuse for non-performance of a duty is a satisfactory substitute for performance. For us, there can be no excuses. Either we perform our duty or we do not. If we do not, we need no excuse. We simply accept the responsibility for failure. And if there is a penalty, we accept that too. The penalty for oath breaking is death. The room was perfectly still, but I could hear a buzzing in my ears, and the floor seemed to sway under my feet. I stood in stunned silence until Williams began speaking again, this time in a somewhat softer voice. The duty of this tribunal is clear, Earl Turner. We must act in your case in such a way that every member of this order who may, at some time in the future, find himself in circumstances similar to yours during the police raid on your headquarters will know that death is inevitable if he cannot avoid capture. Either an honorable death by his own hand or a less than honorable death at the hands of his comrades later. There must be no temptation for him to avoid his duty, in the hope that a good excuse later will preserve his life. Some of us here today have argued that this consideration, setting a firm example for others, should be the sole determination of your fate. But others of us have argued that because you had not yet achieved full membership in this order at the time in question, because you had not yet participated in the right of union, your conduct can be reasonably judged by a different standard than would be applied to someone who had completed his probationary period and achieved union. Our decision has not been easy, but now you must hear it and you must abide by it. First, you must satisfactorily complete your extended period of probation. Then, at some time after the end of that period, you will be permitted union, but only on a conditional basis, something we have never allowed before. The condition will be that you undertake a mission whose successful completion can reasonably be expected to result in your death. Unfortunately, we are all too often presented with the painful task of assigning such suicide missions to our members when we can find no other way to achieve a necessary goal. In your case, such a mission will serve two ends. If you complete it successfully, the act of completion will remove the condition from your union. Then, even though you die, you will continue to live in us and in our successors for as long as our order endures, just as with any other member who achieves union and then loses his life. And if by some chance you should survive your mission, you may then take your place in our ranks with no strain on your record. Do you understand everything I have said? I nodded and answered, yes, I understand, and I accept your judgment without reservation. It is just and proper. I have never expected to survive the struggle in which we are now engaged, and I am grateful that I will be allowed to make a further contribution to it. I am also grateful that the prospect of union remains before me. March 25th. Today, Henry came over, and he, Bill, and I had a long talk. Henry is headed for the West Coast tomorrow, and he wanted to help Bill fill me in on the developments of the past year before he leaves. Apparently, he will be engaged in training new recruits and handling some of the organization's other internal functions in the Los Angeles area, where we are especially strong. When he greeted me, he showed me the sign, and I knew that he had also become a member of the order. In essence, what I learned today is what I had already concluded in my prison cell. The organization has shifted the main thrust of its attacks from tactical personal targets to strategic economic targets. We are no longer trying to destroy the system directly, but are now concentrating on undermining the general public's support for the system. I have felt for a long time that this change is necessary. Apparently, two things forced Revolutionary Command to the same conclusion. The fact that we were not recruiting enough new members to make up our losses in the war of attrition against the system, and the fact that neither our blows against the system nor the system's increasingly represented and the fact that neither our blows against the system nor the system's increasingly repressive responses to those blows were having any really decisive effect on the public's attitude towards the system. The first factor was mandatory. We simply could not keep up our level of activity against the system as our casualties steadily mounted, even if we wanted to. Henry estimated that the total number of our frontline combat troops for the whole country, those ready and able to use knife, gun, or bomb against the system, had declined to a low point of about 400 persons last summer. Our frontline troops make up only about a fourth of the organization's membership, and they have been suffering a greatly disproportionate casualty rate. So the organization was forced to de escalate the level of the war temporarily, while we still preserved a strong enough nucleus for another approach. Our whole strategy against the system was failing. It was failing because the bulk of white Americans were not responding to the situation in the way we had hoped they would. That is, we had counted on a positive, imitative response to our propaganda of the deed, but it was not forthcoming. We had hoped that when we set the example of resisting the system's tyranny, others would resist too. We had hoped that by making dramatic strikes against top system personalities in important system facilities, we would inspire Americans everywhere to initiate similar actions of their own. But for the most part, the bastards just sat on their asses. Sure, a dozen or so synagogues were burned, and there was an overall rise in the level of politically motivated violence, but it was generally misdirected and ineffective. Without organization, such activities have little value unless they are very widespread and can be sustained over a long period. And the system's response to the organization irritated many people and caused a lot of grumbling, but it didn't even come close to provoking a rebellion. Tyranny, we have discovered, just isn't all that unpopular among the American people. What is really precious to the average American is not his freedom or his honor or the future of his race, but his paycheck. He complained when the system began busing his kids to black schools 20 years ago, but he was allowed to keep his station wagon and his fiberglass speedboat, so he didn't fight. He complained when they took away his guns 5 years ago, but he still had his color TV and his backyard barbecue, so he didn't fight. And he complains today when the blacks rape his women at will and the system makes him show an identity pass to buy groceries or pick up his laundry. But he still has a full belly most of the time, so he won't fight. He hasn't an idea in his head that wasn't put there by his TV set. He desperately wants to be well adjusted and to do and think and say exactly what he thinks is expected of him. He has become, in short, just what the system has been trying to make of him these past 50 years or so. A mass man, a member of the great brainwashed proletariat, a herd animal, a true Democrat. That, unfortunately, is our average white American. We can wish that it weren't so, but it is. The plain, horrible truth is that we have been trying to evoke a heroic spirit of idealism which just isn't there anymore. It has been washed right out of 99% of our people by the flood of Jewish materialism propaganda in which they have been submerged practically all of their lives. As for the last 1%, there are various reasons why they aren't doing us much good. Some, of course, are too ornery to work within the confines of the organization or any organized group. They can only do their own thing as a number, in fact, are. The others may still have different ideas of their own, or they simply may not have been able to make contact with us since we were forced underground. Eventually, we could recruit most of these, but we no longer have the time. What the organization began doing about 6 months ago is treating Americans realistically for the first time, namely, like a herd of cattle. Since they are no longer capable of responding to an idealistic appeal, We began appealing to things they can understand: fear and hunger. We will take the food off their tables and empty their refrigerators. We will rob the system of its principal hold over them. And when they begin getting hungry, we will make them fear us more than they fear the system. We will treat them exactly the way they deserve to be treated. I don't know why we had held back from this approach for so long. We have had the example of decades of guerrilla warfare in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to instruct us. In every case, the guerrillas won by making the people fear them, not love them, by publicly torturing to death village leaders who opposed them, and by carrying out brutal massacres of entire village populations which refused to feed them. They inspired such terror in neighboring villages that everyone was afraid to refuse them what they asked. We Americans observed all of this but failed to apply the lesson to ourselves. We regarded correctly all of those non-whites as mere herds of animals and were not surprised that they behaved as they did. But we regarded ourselves incorrectly, as something better. There was a time when we were better, and we are fighting to ensure that there will be such a time again. But for now, we are merely a herd, being manipulated through our basest instincts by a pack of clever aliens. We have sunk to the point where we no longer hate our oppressors or try to fight them. We merely fear them and attempt to curry favor with them. So be it. We will suffer grievously for having allowed ourselves to fall under the Jewish spell. We stopped wasting our resources in small-scale terror attacks and shifted to large-scale attacks on carefully selected economic targets: power stations, fuel depots, transportation facilities, food sources, key industrial plants. We do not expect to bring down the already creaky American economic structure immediately, but we do expect to cause a number of localized and temporary breakdowns, which will gradually have a cumulative effect on the whole public. Already, a sizable portion of the public has been made to realize that it will not be allowed to sit back and watch the war on TV in safety and comfort. In Houston, for example, hundreds of thousands went for nearly 2 weeks without electricity last September. The food in their refrigerators and freezers quickly spoiled, as did the perishables in their supermarkets. There were 2 major food riots by hungry Houstonans before the army was able to set up enough relief stations to handle everyone. In one instance, federal troops shot 26 persons in a mob trying to storm a government food depot. And then the organization got another riot started with the rumor that the emergency rations the government was handing out were contaminated with botulism. Houston isn't back to normal yet, with most of the city still subject to a staggering 6-hour-a-day power blackout. In Wilmington, we put half the city on the dole by blowing up 2 big DuPont plants. And we turned the lights off for half of New England when we knocked out that power generating station just outside of Providence. The electronics manufacturer we hit in Racine wasn't very big, but he was the sole supplier of a certain key component for other manufacturers all across the country. By torching this plant, we eventually caused 20 others to shut down. The effects of these actions are not decisive yet, but if we can keep it up, they will be. The public reaction has already convinced us of that. That reaction can certainly not be considered friendly to us on the whole. In Houston, a mob took 2 prisoners, suspects arrested for questioning in one of the bombings, away from the police and tore them limb from limb. Fortunately, they were not our people, just two hapless fellows who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the conservatives, of course, have redoubled their squawking and cackling that we're ruining all chances for an improvement in conditions by provoking the government with our violence. What the conservatives mean when they talk of an improvement is a stabilization of the economy and another round of concessions to the blacks, so that everyone can return to consuming in multiracial comfort. But we learned long ago not to count our enemies, only our friends, and the number of the latter is growing now. Henry indicated that we have increased nearly 50% in membership since last summer. Apparently, our new strategy has knocked a lot of spectators off the fence, some on our side and some on the other. Perceptive people are beginning to realize that they won't be able to sit this war out. We are forcing them into the front lines, where they must choose sides and participate, whether they like it or not. And that's it for chapter 14. Come back tonight for the breakdown, where we'll go over that, and then stop back in tomorrow for chapter 15. Check you YouTubers out later.